December 1831, Plymouth Harbor. A young man stands on the deck of HMS Beagle watching England recede into cold mist. Charles Darwin is 22 years old, recently graduated from Cambridge where he studied theology, the profession his father intended for him. But Darwin has no passion for ministry, has passion instead for beetles and rocks, for collecting and observing, for the natural world in all its bewildering variety. When the opportunity came to join the Beagle as gentleman companion to Captain Fitzroy, to serve as the voyage's naturalist, to spend years exploring distant shores, Darwin seized it despite his father's objections. The ship is small, only 90 feet long, crowded with 7 to 4 crew members and provisions for years at sea. Darwin's quarters are tiny. His hammock hangs in the chart room, but the space is sufficient. Is more than sufficient for young man about to see the world, about to witness geology and biology on scales that England cannot offer, about to accumulate observations that will slowly, quietly, inevitably lead him to question everything he believes about creation. The voyage will last 5 years, will circumnavigate the globe, will carry Darwin to South America, to the Galapagos Islands, to Australia, to Africa. We'll show him tropical rainforests where life multiplies in forms beyond counting, volcanic islands where new land rises from the sea, coral reefs building slowly over millennia, fossils embedded in cliffs testifying to life that existed long before present forms. The voyage is not planned as scientific revolution. It's simply exploratory mission. The Beagle is surveying South American coastline, charting waters, mapping harbors. Darwin's role is modest. Is to collect specimens, to make observations, to send materials back to England for study. But the collections will accumulate, the observations will multiply, and slowly, without intending to, Darwin will gather evidence that will transform biology. The first months are difficult. Darwin is seasick almost constantly. The rolling of the ship in open ocean makes him miserable. He spends days in his hammock, unable to eat, wishing he had never left England. But when the Beagle reaches land, when Darwin can disembark and explore, the misery is forgotten. In Brazil, he enters rainforest and is overwhelmed by the diversity. The trees draped with vines, the insects in every color, the birds whose songs fill the canopy, the monkeys swinging overhead, the abundance is almost incomprehensible. How many species exist here? How did they all come to be? The questions form but do not yet have answers. Darwin collects beetles obsessively. Finds species after species that are new to science. Ships specimens back to England by the hundreds. The collecting is not yet theory building, is simply the work of naturalists documenting what exists, but the documentation accumulates, the diversity becomes data. In Argentina, Darwin finds fossils, giant armadillos, extinct horses, enormous ground sloths, creatures that once lived here but live no longer. The fossils are massive, are nothing like the animals currently inhabiting the pampas, but the fossils also show resemblances. The extinct armadillo resembles the living armadillo but is much larger. The extinct horse resembles horses but is slightly different in structure. Darwin begins to wonder, is there connection between extinct forms and living forms? Did the living descend from the extinct? Did species change over time? The wondering is tentative, is not yet theory. Is simply the beginning of seeing pattern where before there had been only isolated observations. The fossils are packed carefully, are shipped to England where they will be studied by experts. But the questions remain with Darwin, accumulate alongside the specimens. The Beagle reaches the Galapagos Islands in September 1835. The islands are volcanic black lava fields, barren landscapes, harsh conditions, but life has colonized even here. Darwin explores each island, collects birds and reptiles and plants, notices that each island has slightly different species. The mockingbirds vary from island to island. The tortoises have different shell shapes depending on which island they inhabit. The finches, though Darwin does not yet realize their significance, show remarkable variation in beak shape and size. Darwin collects specimens from each island, labels them carefully by location, does not yet understand what he is seeing. The understanding will come later, back in England, when experts examine the collections and reveal that what Darwin thought were different species of birds are actually varieties of single species, modified by isolation on different islands. The Galapagos plants the seed, plants the question that will grow over decades into theory. If species vary by island, if isolation produces modification, if extinct forms resemble living forms, what does this suggest about creation? Were species created separately on each island? That seems wasteful, seems unlike the divine efficiency Darwin has been taught to expect. Or did species somehow arise from common ancestors, modified by their circumstances, shaped by their environments? The alternative seems impossible, contradicts Genesis, contradicts everything Darwin believes about creation's fixity. But the evidence keeps accumulating, keeps suggesting that species are not fixed, that life changes. That creation is not single event but ongoing process. The voyage continues to Australia, where Darwin sees marsupials, mammals that carry young in pouches, that fill ecological niches occupied by different animals on other continents. Why would Australia have unique mammals unless isolation allowed separate evolutionary paths? To coral reefs, where Darwin develops theory of atoll formation, understanding that reefs build slowly as volcanic islands sink, understanding that geological time allows processes too slow to observe directly. The coral theory is Darwin's first major scientific achievement, is proof that he can think originally about natural processes, is also training in thinking about vast time scales, about changes too gradual to witness but too significant to ignore. The coral reefs teach patience. Teach that nature works slowly. Teach that great transformations happen through small changes accumulated over immense periods. By the time the Beagle returns to England in October 1836, Darwin is changed, has seen too much diversity to believe in simple separate creation, has witnessed too much variation to accept species fixity, has collected too much evidence of change over time to maintain certainty about creation's permanence. The young man who sailed believing in fixed species returns suspecting transformation. The collections fill crates, thousands of specimens, hundreds of pages of notes, years of observations. The material will require decades to analyze fully, but the seed is planted, the question is asked. The voyage that was meant to chart coastlines has instead charted pathway toward evolutionary theory. The young naturalist returns home carrying not just specimens but doubt, productive doubt, questioning doubt, the doubt that drives scientific understanding forward by refusing to accept what cannot be adequately explained. The voyage ends, the collections are distributed to experts, the specimens are studied, and Darwin begins the long process of understanding what he has seen. The process will take years, will require courage, will demand that he think thoughts too dangerous for Victorian gentlemen to speak aloud, but the voyage has prepared him, has shown him that the natural world is not simple product of 7 days' creation, but is complex, ancient, constantly changing reality that demands explanation adequate to its observed diversity. The voyage that opened eyes to endless forms, the 5 years that transformed belief into question, the journey that carried young man from certainty to wondering, forever the beginning. Forever the seed planted, forever the opening of eyes that could not be closed again. The voyage, the collections, the slow dawning of understanding that would consume the rest of Darwin's life and would transform biology forever. Home in England, Darwin settles into life of Victorian gentleman naturalist, moves to London, joins scientific societies, begins publishing on the Beagle's geological findings, becomes recognized as promising young scientist, careful observer, talented writer. Publicly he is respectable. Publicly he works on safe topics: coral reefs, volcanic islands, the distribution of species. But privately, in leather-bound notebooks that he keeps locked away, Darwin begins exploring dangerous territory, begins thinking thoughts that Victorian society would condemn, begins developing theory that will contradict Genesis, challenge Christianity, disturb every assumption about humanity's special status. The notebooks are his secret laboratory, are the space where he can think freely without fear of condemnation, where he can follow evidence wherever it leads, where heresy can be born in private before facing public judgment. July 1837, less than a year after returning from the voyage. Darwin opens a new notebook and writes at the top, Zoonomia, the title borrowed from his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, who had speculated about evolutionary transformation decades earlier. In this first notebook on transmutation of species, Darwin begins systematically thinking through what the Beagle voyage suggested, begins assembling evidence that species are not fixed, that they change over time, that they arise from common ancestors through process of modification. The writing is tentative at first, is testing ideas rather than asserting conclusions. I think, he writes beside simple diagram tree with branching lines representing how species might diverge from common origin. Two words, I think, that will echo through history. Two words that capture the moment when speculation becomes theory, when observation becomes understanding, when the pattern suddenly crystallizes from the accumulated data. The notebooks multiply. He fills one after another with observations, questions, calculations, sketches. Reads widely Malthus on population, agricultural journals on breeding, philosophy of science, anything that might illuminate the problem. The reading combines with his own observations in productive ferment. Malthus describes how populations tend to increase faster than food supply, leading to competition and struggle. Darwin sees immediately how this applies to nature, sees that more organisms are born than can possibly survive, sees that there must be selection, that those best adapted to their environment will survive and reproduce while others perish. Sees that this selection, acting on natural variation over many generations, could slowly transform species, could create the diversity he observed during the voyage, could explain everything without requiring divine intervention at each step. The theory forms gradually in the notebooks, forms through writing, through thinking on paper, through working through implications and objections. Darwin is methodical, anticipates every criticism, considers every alternative explanation. Tests his theory against every observation he can think of. The notebooks show his mind at work, careful, patient, thorough, unwilling to accept conclusion until evidence is overwhelming. But the evidence keeps supporting the theory, keeps confirming that natural selection explains what separate creation cannot explain, explains why island species resemble mainland species, explains why fossils show progression from simple to complex, explains why embryos of different species resemble each other, explains vestigial organs that serve no function but testify to ancestry where they did serve function. The theory explains too much to be wrong, fits too perfectly with observed facts to be mere speculation. But Darwin does not publish, does not announce his theory, does not share the notebooks with anyone except closest friends. The heresy remains private for reason publishing would be catastrophic, would destroy his reputation among fellow scientists who still believe in special creation, would alienate him from Victorian society that reads Genesis literally, would cause pain to his wife Emma, devout Christian who would be wounded by theory denying divine creation, by implication that humans descended from animals, by suggestion that morality evolved rather than being bestowed by God. Darwin loves Emma, values her happiness above his scientific ambitions, cannot bear thought of causing her pain. So the notebooks remain secret, the theory matures in darkness. The evidence accumulates privately while Darwin maintains public face of conventional naturalist. The notebooks reveal his crisis, show him wrestling with implications of his own theory. If humans evolved, if we are animals rather than special creations, what does this mean for morality, for consciousness, for free will? Darwin fills pages with observations about human behavior that suggest animal origins. Notes how emotions are expressed through body language similar to animals' expressions. Notes how children and savages, in language of his time, show stages of development resembling evolutionary progression. Notes how morality could evolve through social selection, how tribes with cooperation and altruism would survive better than tribes without. The observations are uncomfortable. Push toward conclusion that there is no fundamental difference between humans and animals, that we are continuous with nature rather than separate from it, that our cherished belief in human uniqueness is illusion created by our own evolved capacity for abstract thought. The notebooks are also workshop, a place where Darwin develops arguments he will eventually use, works out how to present evidence most persuasively, practices addressing objections, learns how to build case so thoroughly that opposition cannot dismiss it as speculation. The notebooks teach him patience, teach him that revolutionary theory requires revolutionary evidence, that claiming species evolve is not enough, must demonstrate how they evolve, must provide mechanism, must show that natural processes are adequate to explain observed diversity. The patience will serve him well. When he finally publishes, the careful accumulation of evidence in the notebooks will translate into book that cannot be easily dismissed. Years pass, the notebooks multiply. Darwin marries Emma, moves to Down House in Kent countryside, begins raising family. Publicly he works on barnacles, spends 8 years classifying every known barnacle species, publishing massive taxonomic works that establish him as serious scientist. The barnacle work seems like distraction from evolution theory, but is actually essential preparation, is learning anatomy intimately, is seeing variation within species, is understanding how classification works, how relationships are determined, how evidence of common ancestry is recognized. The barnacles teach him in detail what the voyage taught him in overview: that species are not fixed, that variation is ubiquitous, that relationships suggest descent rather than separate creation. But still he does not publish on evolution. Still the theory remains in notebooks, still the heresy is private. Darwin develops chronic illness during these years: stomach pains, vomiting, exhaustion that keeps him from working more than a few hours daily. The illness has been attributed to various causes: tropical disease from the voyage, stress from his secret theory, psychosomatic expression of anxiety about publishing. Whatever the cause, the illness forces slower pace, forces retreat from public life, forces him into routine at Down House, where he works in morning, rests in afternoon, avoids the stress of scientific controversy in London. The illness becomes permanent condition, becomes part of his life, but also becomes protection, gives him excuse to avoid public debates, to work privately, to maintain the careful, controlled existence where secret theory can mature without forcing confrontation with hostile world. 20 years will pass between the first transmutation notebook in 1837 and the publication of Origin of Species in 1859. 20 years of private theory building while maintaining public silence. 20 years of accumulating evidence while postponing announcement. 20 years of knowing truth that he cannot yet speak. The notebooks document this long gestation, show the theory forming, maturing, being tested against every observation and every objection until Darwin is certain, until the evidence is overwhelming, until only publication remains, but publication is delayed again and again. The notebooks where heresy was born, where revolutionary theory developed in secret, where Darwin became convinced of truth too dangerous to proclaim. The private wrestling with public silence, the careful building of case that might withstand inevitable assault. The notebooks, forever the hidden beginning, forever the secret laboratory where evolutionary theory was born, forever Darwin's private revolution waiting for moment when it could become public transformation. The notebooks, the heresy, the waiting, forever. In the Galapagos Islands, volcanic archipelago 600 miles off Ecuador's coast, finches live. 13 species across the islands, each shaped differently, each adapted to particular way of life. Some have thick, powerful beaks for cracking hard seeds. Some have slender, probing beaks for extracting insects from bark. Some have parrot-like beaks for grasping fruit. Some have crossed beaks for prying seeds from cones. The variety is remarkable. The differences are visible even to casual observer, but what do the differences mean? Are these 13 separate creations, each designed perfectly for its niche? Or are they modifications of common ancestor, variations on single theme, evidence that isolation and adaptation can produce new forms? Darwin collected the finches during the Beagle's visit to the Galapagos in 1835. Collected specimens from different islands, labeled them by location, packed them carefully for shipment to England. but he did not immediately recognize their significance, did not understand what he was seeing. The finches seemed like different species. Some he thought were wrens, some he classified as blackbirds, some he correctly identified as finches. The variation confused him. The pattern was not yet clear. Only later, back in England, when ornithologist John Good examined the specimens, did the truth emerge. These were not different kinds of birds, were all finches, were all variations on single family, were evidence of something Darwin had not yet fully understood, that species could diverge from common ancestor, that isolation on different islands could produce different forms, that adaptation to different food sources could reshape beaks across generations. The revelation comes slowly. Good reports his findings in 1837. Darwin consults his notes, realizes he did not keep careful records of which finches came from which islands. The oversight frustrates him, but the pattern is clear enough. The finches vary by island. The variations correspond to available food sources. The beaks are adaptations. The species are related. The implications crystallize. If these 13 species descended from single ancestral finch that colonized the islands, if isolation allowed separate populations to adapt to different foods, if natural selection favored those with beaks best suited to available seeds or insects, then species are not fixed, are not separate creations, are products of natural processes acting over time. The finches become symbol, become evidence too elegant to dismiss. Become case study that Darwin will return to again and again in his thinking about evolution. The beauty of the finches is their simplicity. The Galapagos are young islands, volcanic formations only a few million years old. The finches could not have existed before the islands formed, must have colonized from mainland, must have diversified after arrival. The diversification is documented in the beaks each species, showing adaptations that make evolutionary sense, that correspond to ecological niche, that reveal process of modification through selection. The finches teach the mechanism, teach how evolution happens in real time in observable space through process that can be understood and predicted. Darwin imagines the process. Imagines ancestral finches arriving on the islands, perhaps blown off course from South American coast by storm. The colonizers would have found islands with various food sources: hard seeds, soft seeds, insects in bark, cactus, flowers, different resources on different islands. The finches that happen to have slightly larger beaks might crack larger seeds more easily. Those with slightly smaller, more delicate beaks might probe more effectively for insects. Over generations, the populations would shift. The larger-beaked individuals would survive better on islands with hard seeds, would pass their beak size to offspring, would gradually produce population of larger-beaked finches. The small-beaked individuals would thrive where insects were primary food, would produce population of small-beaked finches. The process repeats across islands, across generations, across hundreds of thousands of years. The result is 13 species where once there was one. The result is diversity arising from unity. The result is evolution observable in present-day distribution. The finches also teach about competition and specialization. On islands with multiple finch species, the species partition resources. They do not all compete for same food. Instead, they specialize each species, focusing on particular food source, developing beak shape that maximizes efficiency in exploiting that resource. The specialization reduces competition, allows multiple species to coexist. Creates ecosystem where diversity is sustainable because each species fills different niche. The lesson is profound, is evidence that natural selection produces not just adaptation but also diversification, not just survival but also coexistence, not just present forms but also potential for endless future forms as environments continue changing and species continue adapting. The song variations are equally telling. Finches on different islands sing differently. The songs are learned. Young finches learn by listening to adults. But the songs also vary in ways that correspond to beak shape. The larger-beaked finches produce lower-pitched songs. The small-beaked finches produce higher-pitched songs. The correlation is not accidental. is evidence that multiple traits are selected together, that beak shape and song and behavior and ecology are integrated package, that evolution works on whole organism rather than on single trait in isolation. The singing on different islands becomes metaphor for evolutionary process, each population developing its own variation on theme, each lineage diverging from common origin while maintaining recognizable resemblance to ancestors and cousins. Darwin will write about the Galapagos finches in Origin of Species. We'll use them as example of how isolation and adaptation produce new species. We'll explain how their variation demonstrates principle that is universal, that natural selection acting on variation over time produces diversity. The finches will become iconic, will be called Darwin's finches, though Darwin himself never used that term. Will be studied intensively by later biologists who will document ongoing evolution in real time, who will show that beak sizes shift measurably across just a few generations in response to changing food availability, who will prove that the process Darwin inferred from distribution patterns is actually observable in present day. The finches will teach generation after generation of students about evolution. Will be among the clearest, most compelling examples of how species arise through natural processes. But in the 1830s, as Darwin examines Good's report and realizes what the finches mean, the significance is personal and immediate. The finches are confirmation, are evidence that his developing theory is correct. Our demonstration that species are not fixed, that variation leads to divergence, that isolation allows populations to become distinct species, that natural selection shapes living things through simple process of survival and reproduction. The finches give Darwin confidence, give him evidence he can point to when he finally publishes, give him case study that is concrete and comprehensible and convincing. The finches that sang different songs on different islands. Beaks that told story of adaptation, the species that revealed process of transformation, forever the evidence, forever the symbol, forever Darwin's confirmation that species evolve, the finches, the songs, the beaks, the islands where evolution wrote its story in living flesh, forever teaching, forever testifying, forever the finches that changed everything by simply being what they were, variations on theme, modifications of ancestor, evidence of evolution's endless creativity. The finches. Forever. Darwin has known since the notebooks began in 1837, has known since the finches revealed their pattern, has known since the fossils suggested ancestry and change, has known since hundreds of observations accumulated into understanding that could not be dismissed. Species are not fixed, they evolve, they descend with modification from common ancestors. Natural selection acting on variation over vast time produces all life's diversity. The theory is formed. The evidence is gathered, the mechanism is understood, Darwin is convinced, is certain of his theory's truth, but Darwin does not publish, does not announce, does not proclaim the revolutionary understanding that possesses him. Instead, he falls silent, silent for 20 years, 2 decades of knowing without speaking, 2 decades of private certainty and public discretion, 2 decades of carrying truth too dangerous to share. The silence is not simple. Is not cowardice, though courage will be required to break it, is not laziness, though Darwin works constantly to perfect his argument, is not doubt, though Darwin questions every aspect of his theory with relentless thoroughness. The silence is complex calculation. Is recognition that publishing will cost him everything he values, reputation among fellow scientists who still believe in special creation, position in Victorian society that expects scientific findings to confirm religious teaching, peace with his wife whose Christian faith is central to her life and who will be wounded by theory that denies divine creation. The silence protects Darwin from controversy, protects Emma from distress, protects the theory itself from premature exposure before evidence is overwhelming and argument is bulletproof. The weight of knowing without speaking is visible in Darwin's chronic illness. The stomach pains and exhaustion that begin in these years, that never fully leave him, that force him into semi-invalid existence at Down House. The illness has been diagnosed and re-diagnosed: tropical disease, anxiety disorder, psychosomatic expression of stress about his secret theory. Whatever the medical explanation, the timing is revealing. Darwin becomes ill during the years when he is working on transmutation theory while maintaining public silence about it. The illness forces withdrawal from London scientific society, forces retreat to countryside, forces existence focused on family and private research rather than public debate. The illness becomes both burden and protection, makes social engagement difficult but also makes isolation acceptable, makes daily work harder but also makes absence from scientific controversies explicable. During these silent years, Darwin continues gathering evidence, continues refining the theory, continues building case that will eventually appear in Origin of Species. The work is meticulous, is obsessive in its thoroughness. Darwin corresponds with breeders of dogs and pigeons, with gardeners who cultivate flowers, with anyone who can provide information about variation and selection. He conducts experiments in his garden and greenhouse, breeds pigeons himself to understand how artificial selection works, how breeders can produce dramatic changes in just a few generations through choosing which individuals reproduce. The pigeon breeding teaches him about natural selection's power. If human selection can produce such changes so quickly, imagine what natural selection can accomplish over millions of years. Darwin also works on barnacles, spends 8 years from 1846 to 1854 classifying every known barnacle species, publishing 4 massive volumes of detailed taxonomic research. The barnacle work seems like distraction. Many wonder why Darwin is wasting time on obscure crustaceans when he could be working on bigger questions. But the barnacle research serves multiple purposes, establishes Darwin's credentials as serious systematic biologist, not just collector and speculator, teaches him anatomy in extraordinary detail, shows him variation within species, demonstrates how classification reveals relationships that suggest common ancestry. The barnacles are training. Our preparation for the larger work, our evidence gathering at microscopic level that will support theoretical claims at cosmic scale. But the barnacle work also delays, adds 8 years to the already long silence. Some historians believe Darwin used barnacles as excuse not to publish on evolution, used detailed taxonomic work as justification for not writing the revolutionary book that waited. The interpretation may be correct. Darwin certainly procrastinated, certainly found reasons to delay, but the delay was not simply avoidance, was also perfectionism, was determination not to publish until evidence was overwhelming, until argument was unassailable, until every objection had been anticipated and addressed. Darwin understood that revolutionary claim requires revolutionary evidence, that overturning accepted doctrine of special creation requires case so strong that rejection becomes harder than acceptance. The silence also protects Emma. Darwin's wife is devout Christian, believes in God, in salvation, in eternal life. Darwin's theory threatens all of this, suggests that humans are animals, that morality evolved rather than being divinely ordained, that consciousness arose through natural processes rather than being breathed into humans by God. Emma knows Darwin is working on transmutation, knows he has dangerous ideas. She reads some of his drafts and pleads with him to reconsider, to not reject God's role in creation, to remember that eternal life requires faith that evolution seems to undermine. The pleading comes from love, from fear that Darwin's soul is at risk, from concern that publishing will damage not just their earthly happiness but their eternal prospects. Darwin cannot dismiss Emma's concerns, loves her too deeply, values her happiness too much, so he delays. Continues working privately while avoiding public declaration that would wound her. The weight of silence increases with years. Darwin is not only scientist with evolutionary ideas, others are thinking along similar lines. Robert Chambers publishes Vestiges of Creation in 1844, anonymous work suggesting species arise through natural processes. The book is wildly popular but scientifically criticized for lacking evidence and rigorous argument. Darwin is horrified by the reception. sees how evolutionary ideas are attacked when not properly supported, becomes even more determined to delay until his own evidence is sufficient. But the delay means risk that someone else will publish first, will receive credit for theory Darwin has already developed, will preempt the careful work of 2 decades. Friends know about Darwin's theory. Charles Lyell, the geologist whose work influenced Darwin profoundly, knows. Joseph Hooker, the botanist who becomes Darwin's closest confidant, knows. Both encourage Darwin to publish, both warn that priority is at risk, but Darwin continues hesitating, continues perfecting, continues accumulating evidence, is planning massive multi-volume work presenting every detail of evolutionary theory, every piece of evidence, every response to every possible objection. The work is titled Natural Selection in his drafts, is meant to be definitive treatise. Is intended to overwhelm opposition through sheer weight of evidence, but the work progresses slowly, will take years more to complete, the silence stretches. By 1858, Darwin has been working on evolution theory for over 20 years, has filled notebooks and written draft essays and accumulated enough evidence to fill multiple volumes, has convinced himself completely that species evolve through natural selection, but has published nothing. Has maintained public silence despite private certainty, has postponed indefinitely the confrontation with Victorian society that publication will bring. The weight of knowing is immense, his burden of possessing truth that will transform biology but will disturb theology, of understanding mechanism that explains life's diversity but challenges human dignity, of being convinced but afraid, certain but cautious, ready but waiting. The silence of 20 years, the weight of knowing. The delay that is partly wisdom and partly fear, forever the gap between discovery and declaration, forever the burden of revolutionary truth held privately, forever Darwin carrying alone what the world is not yet ready to hear, the silence, the weight, the knowing without speaking, forever. June 1858, a letter arrives at Down House from halfway around the world. Alfred Russel Wallace, young naturalist collecting specimens in the Malay archipelago, has written essay outlining theory of evolution through natural selection. The essay is enclosed with letter asking Darwin to review it, to forward it to Charles Lyell if worthy of publication, to help introduce Wallace's ideas to scientific community. Darwin opens the letter, begins reading the essay, and experiences moment of pure shock. Wallace has independently arrived at essentially the same theory Darwin has been developing privately for 20 years, has described natural selection, has explained how variation and struggle for existence lead to adaptation, has understood the mechanism that Darwin thought was his own discovery. The essay is not as detailed as Darwin's work, does not have 20 years of accumulated evidence, but the core insight is identical. Wallace has seen what Darwin has seen, has understood what Darwin has understood, has written what Darwin has not yet dared to publish. Darwin is devastated. The letter represents catastrophe. Years of careful work threatened by simultaneous independent discovery. Priority, the recognition that scientist craves, the acknowledgement of being first to understand appears to be lost. Darwin has waited too long, has been too cautious, has protected his theory so carefully that another has discovered it independently. The devastation is not simply egotistical, is recognition that delaying publication has cost him the unique claim to revolutionary insight, that hesitation has consequences, that the theory he has nurtured privately for 2 decades will now be associated with Wallace as much as with himself. The simultaneous discovery is testament to theory's truth. 2 scientists working independently, following different paths, reaching same conclusion suggests that the conclusion reflects reality rather than mere speculation. But for Darwin, the testament is cold comfort. Priority matters, recognition matters. The work of 20 years seems suddenly vulnerable to being eclipsed by essay written in weeks. Darwin writes immediately to Lyell. The letter is agonized. Your words have come true with a vengeance that I should be forestalled. I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters. The recognition that Wallace independently developed same theory is both validation and tragedy. validation because it confirms Darwin's understanding was correct. Tragedy because it means Darwin's long silence has cost him sole credit for the discovery. The letter to Lyell continues, "So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. The despair is genuine. The fear of losing priority is not vanity, but is recognition that scientific discoveries belong to whoever publishes first, that private knowledge counts for nothing without public declaration, that hesitation has consequences." Lyell and Hooker intervene. They know Darwin has been working on evolution for decades. No, he has unpublished essays from 1842 and 1844 outlining natural selection. No, he has accumulated evidence far beyond anything Wallace has presented. They propose compromised joint presentation at Linnean Society in London, where both Darwin's earlier work and Wallace's essay will be read publicly. The presentation will establish both men as co-discoverers of natural selection. Will protect Darwin's priority while acknowledging Wallace's independent insight. Will make public what Darwin has kept private while giving credit where credit is due. Darwin agrees to the arrangement, has no better option, is too ill and too distressed to attend the meeting himself. His infant son dies during this period, adding personal tragedy to scientific crisis. But the presentation proceeds. On July 1, 1858, papers by Darwin and Wallace are read at Linnean Society. The revolutionary theory is announced. Evolution through natural selection becomes public knowledge. 20 years of silence end not through Darwin's choice but through crisis forced by Wallace's letter. The presentation passes almost without notice. The Linnean Society meeting is sparsely attended. The papers are technical. The revolutionary implications are not immediately apparent to those who hear them. The president of the Linnean Society later remarks that the year has not been marked by any striking discoveries. The irony is profound. Evolution through natural selection, perhaps the most important biological theory ever proposed, is announced to scientific community that does not recognize its significance. The quiet reception provides breathing room. Darwin is not immediately thrust into public controversy. The theory is public but not yet widely known. There is time to prepare more complete presentation, to build argument more thoroughly, to anticipate objections more carefully. But Wallace's letter has accomplished what 20 years of self-persuasion could not, has forced Darwin to publish, has ended the long hesitation. Darwin understands now that he cannot delay further, that the theory will be made public whether he carefully controls that process or not. That his choice is not whether to publish, but only whether to publish quickly and incompletely, or to publish more slowly but more thoroughly. He chooses quick publication, abandons the massive multi-volume work he has been planning, decides instead to write abstract of his theory's shorter book presenting main arguments and key evidence without every detail he has accumulated. The abstract will become Origin of Species, will be written in 13 months of intense work. Will compress decades of thinking into single volume, will be compromised between publishing nothing and publishing everything. Darwin writes frantically through late 1858 and all of 1859, writes despite chronic illness, writes despite grief over son's death, writes despite anxiety about how the book will be received. The writing is therapeutic, is channeling of distress into productivity, is transformation of crisis into opportunity. Wallace's letter has broken the paralysis, has forced decision Darwin could not make himself, has pushed him over threshold from private knowledge to public declaration. The writing is also liberation. After 20 years of silence, Darwin finally puts the theory into form meant for public consumption, finally organizes decades of evidence into coherent argument, finally writes what he has been thinking for so long but has not dared to say. The relief is palpable even through his exhaustion. The book is painful to write but is also release, is ending of silence that has weighed on him for 2 decades. The relationship with Wallace remains cordial. Wallace is generous about the joint presentation, acknowledges Darwin's priority, recognizes that Darwin has been working on the theory far longer. Wallace will later title his own book on evolution Darwinism, acknowledging Darwin's preeminence. The generosity is remarkable. Wallace could have fought for greater recognition. could have emphasized that his discovery was independent and simultaneous, could have claimed equality in credit, but Wallace defers, respects Darwin's decades of prior work, accepts role as co-discoverer rather than equal partner. The relationship becomes friendship. The two will correspond for decades, will support each other's work, will remain allies despite the awkward beginning where Wallace's insight threatened to eclipse Darwin's long-protected priority. The letter from Wallace that ended the waiting, the crisis that forced publication, the simultaneous discovery that validated theory while threatening priority, the intervention of friends that protected Darwin's claim while acknowledging Wallace's insight, the quiet presentation that failed to generate immediate controversy but succeeded in making theory public, the frantic writing that transformed abstract into origin of species, all flowing from single letter arriving in June 1858. All consequences of Darwin's long hesitation meeting Wallace's fresh insight, the letter, the crisis, the ending of silence, forever the catalyst, forever the push Darwin needed but could not give himself, forever the moment when private theory became public knowledge, the letter, the crisis, the transformation, forever. November 24, 1859. John Murray publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. First edition is 1,250 copies. The copies sell out the first day. Darwin's abstract of his theory, 502 pages that he has written in 13 months of intense work, enters world where it will transform biology, challenge theology, disturb every assumption about humanity's place in nature. The book is careful, is measured in tone, is built like fortress wall after wall of evidence, defense after defense against anticipated objections, argument constructed so thoroughly that rejecting it requires rejecting overwhelming accumulation of observations. Darwin does not want to be dismissed as speculator, wants to be taken seriously as scientist presenting evidence-based theory. The careful construction succeeds. Origin cannot be easily ignored, must be engaged with, must be answered. Must be either accepted or refuted with equal care. The book opens not with Galapagos or fossils but with pigeons, with domesticated breeds showing remarkable variation, pouters with inflated crops, fantails with elaborate tail feathers, tumblers that somersault in flight, carriers with enlarged wattles. Darwin has bred pigeons himself, knows that all domestic breeds descended from single wild species, the rock dove. Knows that breeders produced this diversity through artificial selection, choosing which individuals to breed based on desired traits, accumulating small changes over generations until new varieties emerge that look nothing like the ancestral form. The pigeons teach principle, teach that selection acting on variation can produce dramatic changes, teach that if humans can reshape species so thoroughly in centuries, imagine what nature can accomplish over millions of years. The domestic animals are prologue, are evidence that transformation of species is possible, that mechanisms exist for producing new forms, that the question is not whether species can change, but whether nature provides processes analogous to artificial selection. Darwin then introduces struggle for existence, explains Malthus's principle: organisms produce more offspring than can survive, creating competition for limited resources. A single pair of elephants breeding at slowest reproductive rate of any animal would produce 15 million descendants in 500 years if all survived, but elephant populations remain roughly stable. What happens to the missing millions? They die, they starve, they fall to predators, they fail to reproduce. The struggle is constant, is invisible daily mortality that keeps populations in check, and the struggle creates opportunity for selection. Because not all individuals are equally likely to survive. Those with slight advantages, faster speed, better camouflage, more efficient metabolism, any trait that improves survival or reproduction will on average live longer and produce more offspring than those without the advantages. Over generations, the advantageous traits will become more common. The population will shift, will adapt, will be shaped by the relentless pressure of competition and mortality. The variation that selection acts upon is ubiquitous. Darwin documents it exhaustively, shows that no two individuals are identical, that variation exists in every population in every trait that can be measured, that the variation is heritable offspring resemble parents more than they resemble random individuals. The combination of variation and heredity with selection creates evolution, creates change over time, creates adaptation, creates, ultimately, new species. Darwin explains the mechanism carefully, explains how small changes accumulate, how populations diverge when subjected to different selection pressures, how isolation allows populations to become distinct, how given enough time, the descendants of common ancestor can become so different that we classify them as separate species, as separate genera, as separate families. The tree of life is not metaphor. Is literal branching process where all living things share ancestry, where divergence from common origin produces diversity we observe today. The evidence Darwin presents is overwhelming. Evidence from geology the Earth is ancient, is old enough for slow processes to produce large changes. Evidence from paleontology fossils show progression from simple to complex, show extinct forms that are transitional between major groups. Evidence from biogeography species distribution reflects history of migration and isolation rather than separate creation. Evidence from comparative anatomy underlying similarities in structure across different animals suggest modification from common ancestor. Evidence from embryology embryos of different species resemble each other more than adults do, suggesting shared developmental program inherited from common ancestor. Evidence from vestigial organ structures like human appendix or whale's hip bones serve no function but testify to ancestry where they did serve function. Layer after layer of evidence, chapter after chapter of careful argument, all supporting conclusion that species evolve through natural selection. Darwin addresses objections methodically, addresses the eye seemingly perfect organ that critics claim could not evolve gradually. Shows that various animals have eyes of intermediate complexity, from simple light-sensitive spots to complex camera eyes, demonstrates that every stage is functional and could be favored by selection. Addresses instinct complex behaviors like beehive construction that seem too sophisticated to arise through gradual evolution. Shows that similar instincts exist in related species at varying levels of complexity, argues that natural selection can shape behavior as readily as anatomy. Addresses hybrid sterility, the fact that crosses between species often produce sterile offspring. Explains this as consequence of accumulated differences rather than as divine barrier preventing interbreeding. Every major objection is anticipated and answered. Darwin has spent 20 years thinking through these problems. The answers are ready. But origin is also notable for what it does not say explicitly. Darwin avoids discussing human evolution directly. Mentions it only once in final pages. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. The understatement is deliberate. Darwin knows that human evolution is most controversial implication of his theory, knows that avoiding it allows the evidence for general principle to be evaluated without immediate religious controversy, but everyone understands the implication. If all species share common ancestry, if natural selection explains diversity, then humans must have evolved from earlier primates. The implication is obvious even though Darwin does not state it explicitly. The avoidance buys time, allows scientific community to engage with theory on its evidence before confronting its most disturbing conclusion. Darwin will address human evolution directly 12 years later in Descent of Man. But in 1859, the subtle approach allows origin to be revolutionary without being explicitly heretical. The book concludes with passage of unusual beauty for scientific work. Darwin writes, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. The sentence captures evolution's poetry. captures the wonder of understanding how simple mechanism produces infinite complexity. Captures Darwin's own awe at the process he has uncovered. The grandeur is genuine, is not merely rhetorical flourish. Is Darwin's authentic response to understanding life's history not diminished by natural explanation but enhanced by it, not made less wonderful by evolution but made more wonderful by recognition of creativity inherent in natural processes. Origin of Species is immediate success as commercial publication. Sells out first day, goes through multiple editions. Is translated into many languages, is read widely by scientists and general public alike, but success does not mean acceptance. The book generates fierce debate. Some scientists embrace it immediately. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's most aggressive defender, declares how extremely stupid not to have thought of that. Upon reading Origin, others remain skeptical. Richard Owen, leading anatomist, opposes theory on scientific and religious grounds. The debate rages through scientific journals and popular press. The book has accomplished what Darwin intended, has forced engagement with evolution, has made theory too prominent to ignore, has begun transformation of biology from collection of observations into unified science organized around principle of descent with modification. The words that shook foundations, the careful argument that could not be dismissed, the publication that ended Darwin's silence and began biology's transformation. Origin of Species, forever the book that changed everything, forever Darwin's gift to science, forever the words that revealed life's history and humanity's place within it. Origin, forever. For 12 years after Origin, Darwin avoids the question that everyone asks, the question that hovers over every discussion of his theory, the question that makes evolution personally threatening rather than merely scientifically interesting. What about humans? If species evolve, if natural selection shapes living things, if all life shares common ancestry, then what about us? Did humans evolve too? Did we descend from earlier primates? Are we simply another branch on life's tree rather than being separate, special creation made in God's image? Origin implied the answer but did not state it explicitly. Mentioned human evolution only once, in single sentence, suggesting that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. The understatement was strategic, was allowing scientific community to engage with evolution's evidence before confronting its most disturbing implication. But the question persists. The implication cannot be ignored, and finally, in 1871, Darwin publishes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Now the implication becomes explicit. Now Darwin argues directly that humans evolved from earlier primates, that we share common ancestor with apes, that our bodies and minds and morals arose through same natural processes that shaped every other living thing, that there is no fundamental discontinuity between humans and animals, that we are part of nature rather than being separate from it. The book is longer than Origin, 2 volumes, 600 pages, exhaustively documented. Darwin knows he is making controversial claim, knows he needs overwhelming evidence, knows that asserting human evolution requires proof that cannot be dismissed as speculation or wishful thinking, so he builds case methodically. Presents evidence from anatomy, from embryology, from rudimentary organs, from mental faculties, from social behaviors. Builds argument so thoroughly that rejecting human evolution requires rejecting all of evolutionary theory. The anatomical evidence is most straightforward. Darwin compares human skeleton with ape skeleton, shows similarities too numerous to be coincidental, the same bones in same arrangement, the same muscles. The same general body plan modified for different modes of locomotion, apes for climbing, humans for upright walking. But underneath the modifications is unmistakable structural similarity testifying to common ancestry. Darwin catalogs the resemblances obsessively, notes that humans have same tooth pattern as Old World monkeys, same arrangement of facial muscles, same internal organs, same basic nervous system. The similarities extend to minutiae, the way certain muscles attach to bones, the pattern of blood vessels, the structure of embryonic development. Every detail supports conclusion that humans are modified apes, that we share recent common ancestor with chimpanzees and gorillas, that our uniqueness is matter of degree rather than kind. The embryological evidence is equally compelling. Human embryos at early stages are nearly indistinguishable from embryos of other mammals. Show gill-like structures similar to fish embryos. Show tails that later disappear. Pass through stages resembling developmental progression from simple to complex that mirrors evolutionary history. Darwin argues that embryonic development recapitulates evolutionary history, that organisms in their development pass through stages resembling their ancestors. The interpretation is not entirely correct in its details. But the fundamental insight is sound that similarities in embryonic development testify to shared ancestry, that development preserves traces of evolutionary history, that human embryos revealing structures seen in other vertebrates is evidence of our descent from earlier vertebrate forms. The vestigial organs are particularly telling. Humans possess structures that serve no function but that make perfect sense as evolutionary relics. The appendix, shrunken remnant of larger organ used for digesting plant material by herbivorous ancestors. Wisdom teeth, third molars that often don't fit in modern human jaw, but that were functional in ancestors with larger jaws and different diet. Muscles that move the ears, present in humans but non-functional, while in many mammals these muscles allow ears to swivel toward sounds. The tailbone, several fused vertebrae that are remnant of tail possessed by ancestral primates. Body hair distributed in patterns that make sense for quadrupedal ancestors but serve little purpose for upright walking humans. Each vestigial structure is evidence, is testimony to ancestry, is proof that humans carry in their bodies the marks of their evolutionary history. But Darwin does not stop with anatomy, extends argument to mental and moral faculties, argues that human intelligence, emotions, and social behaviors evolved. That there is continuity between animal and human psychology, that differences are matters of degree rather than fundamental kind. The argument is provocative, is challenging core assumption of Victorian society that humans are qualitatively different from animals due to possessing rational souls, moral sense, free will, capacities that animals lack. Darwin systematically dismantles the assumption, shows that animals demonstrate intelligence solving problems using tools, learning from experience. Shows that animals experience emotions, fear, anger, affection, jealousy, grief. Shows that animals exhibit social behaviors, cooperation, altruism, even apparent sense of fairness. If animals possess these capacities in simpler forms, then human capacities are elaborations rather than absolute novelties, are evolved rather than bestowed. The moral sense is Darwin's most daring target. Victorian Christianity teaches that morality comes from God. That conscience is divine voice implanted in human souls. That moral behavior distinguishes humans from amoral animals. Darwin argues instead that morality evolved, that conscience arose through natural selection acting on social species. He explains how groups with cooperative members would survive better than groups without cooperation, how individuals who helped group mates would receive help in return, how social instincts, sympathy, reciprocity, concern for reputation would be favored by selection because they improved group survival, how over many generations these social instincts would become strong enough to feel like innate moral sense. The argument is naturalistic explanation for what religion attributes to divine origin, is claiming that our deepest moral intuitions are products of evolution rather than revelations from God. The claim is inflammatory, is attacking sacred ground, is denying human moral uniqueness. Darwin also addresses sexual selection, complementary process to natural selection, where traits evolve not through survival advantage, but through mating advantage. Animals with traits that make them more attractive to potential mates will reproduce more successfully, even if those traits don't improve survival. Peacock's elaborate tail is classic example, makes flying harder and attracts predators, but female peacocks prefer males with impressive tails, so sexual selection favors the trait despite survival costs. Darwin argues that many human characteristics arose through sexual selection. Human hairlessness, varied skin colors, musical ability, aesthetic sense, capacity for language, all potentially products of sexual selection where ancestors with these traits were more successful at attracting mates. The argument extends evolutionary explanation to features that seem unrelated to survival, makes even art and music and language products of natural processes rather than divine gifts. The book provokes fierce reaction. Is more controversial than Origin precisely because it makes explicit what Origin left implicit. Descent of Man cannot be read as merely abstract scientific theory, is direct challenge to human dignity, is claiming that we descended from apes, that our minds evolved from animal minds, that our morals are sophisticated versions of social instincts seen in other species. The religious opposition is intense. Clergy denounce the book as degrading humanity. Cartoons depict Darwin with ape body. Public debates rage about whether humans really descended from monkeys. The ridicule is sometimes vicious. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce mockingly asks whether Darwin claims descent from apes on his grandmother's or grandfather's side. Thomas Huxley responds that he would rather have ape for ancestor than man who uses rhetoric to obscure truth. The exchange captures the conflict religious dignity confronting scientific evidence. But the scientific community increasingly accepts human evolution. The anatomical evidence is too strong. The fossil record is beginning to reveal transitional forms between apes and humans. The logic is inescapable if all other species evolved, if humans share fundamental similarities with apes, if evolution through natural selection is accepted principle, then human evolution follows necessarily. Denying human evolution requires rejecting all of evolutionary theory. Most scientists are unwilling to do so. The evidence for evolution is too overwhelming. The theory explains too much. Accepting evolution while exempting humans is incoherent. So human evolution gradually becomes accepted scientific consensus despite religious opposition, becomes foundation for anthropology and psychology and medicine, becomes framework for understanding human nature not as separate from nature but as part of it. Darwin himself remains mostly withdrawn from public debates, allows Huxley and others to defend descent of man, continues working quietly at Down House on other projects on earthworms, on orchid pollination, on climbing plants. The illness and the temperament that kept him private through Origin's controversies keep him private through descent's controversies. But he has said what needed to be said, has completed the theory by including species that Origin left unmentioned, has spoken the unspoken truth that humans evolved, that we are products of natural processes, that our place in nature is continuous with other living things. The speaking required courage, required accepting that he would be mocked and denounced, required knowingly wounding those who believed in human exceptionalism. But the truth required speaking, required completion of the theory, required honesty about what evolution meant for understanding ourselves, the descent of man. The speaking of unspoken truth, the explicit claim of human evolution, forever controversial, forever challenging human pride, forever completing evolutionary theory by including humanity within its scope, descent, forever the book that said what Origin implied, forever Darwin's most daring argument, forever the claim that we are apes, sophisticated, self-aware, morally complex apes, but apes nonetheless, descended, evolved, natural, forever. Before Darwin, biology was collection, was cataloging of species, description of anatomy, observation of behaviors, accumulation of facts without unifying principle. Naturalists traveled the world gathering specimens. Taxonomists classified living things into groups. Anatomists dissected and described structures. Paleontologists collected fossils. Each discipline pursued its questions independently. Each contributed knowledge, but the knowledge did not cohere, did not connect into unified understanding, was like having stones and timber without architectural plan materials for building, but no vision of what building should be. Darwin provided the vision, provided organizing principle that transformed biology from collection into science. Evolution by natural selection became biology's central theory. became framework that made sense of everything, that explained why species are distributed as they are, why fossils show progression, why embryos resemble each other, why vestigial organs persist, why adaptation occurs. Became unifying principle that every biological observation must be consistent with. The transformation is visible in how biology is practiced. Before Darwin, describing species was sufficient. After Darwin, description must include evolutionary context, how species relates to other species, what adaptations it shows, what ecological niche it occupies, what its evolutionary history reveals. Before Darwin, finding fossil was merely adding specimen to collection. After Darwin, every fossil is potential evidence about evolutionary transitions, about rates of change, about extinctions and radiations. Before Darwin, anatomy was static description. After Darwin, anatomy is understood as product of evolutionary history, every structure testifying to ancestry, every variation revealing adaptation. The shift is profound. Is movement from descriptive science to explanatory science? Is biology becoming able not just to catalog what exists, but to explain why it exists? The cathedral metaphor is apt. Darwin's theory is architecture that organizes biological knowledge into coherent structure. The foundation is deep. Time. Earth is billions of years old, provides temporal scope for evolution to produce all life's diversity. The supporting pillars are evidence from multiple disciplines: geology showing Earth's age, paleontology showing fossil progression, comparative anatomy showing structural similarities, biogeography showing distribution patterns, embryology showing developmental similarities. Each pillar independently supports evolutionary framework. Together they create structure that cannot collapse without all pillars simultaneously failing. The walls are mechanisms: natural selection, sexual selection, geographic isolation, genetic drift, processes through which evolution occurs. The roof is unifying principle: all life shares common ancestry, all diversity arose through descent with modification, all adaptation results from selection acting on variation. The cathedral is built from coral. Darwin's work on coral reefs during Beagle voyage was his first major scientific achievement, was demonstration that he could think originally about natural processes, was also training in thinking about vast time scales. Darwin proposed that coral atolls form through slow process: reef building around volcanic island, island gradually subsiding, reef continuing to grow upward, island eventually disappearing beneath waves, leaving ring-shaped atoll marking where island once stood. The process requires thousands or millions of years, requires understanding that imperceptibly slow changes can produce dramatic results given sufficient time. The coral theory teaches patience, teaches that nature works gradually, teaches principle that applies equally to reefs and to evolution, that time transforms everything, that processes too slow to observe directly can be understood through their results, that present is key to understanding past. The cathedral is built from bones. From fossils that Darwin collected in Argentina: giant extinct armadillos, enormous ground sloths, ancient horses. From transitional fossils discovered after origin was published Archaeopteryx showing mixture of reptile and bird features, found shortly after origin, and providing dramatic confirmation of Darwin's prediction that transitional forms would be discovered. From Tiktaalik showing transition from fish to tetrapod. From countless fossils filling an evolutionary history, documenting transitions that Darwin predicted but could not demonstrate with fossils known in his time. Each fossil is stone in cathedral's construction. Each transition documented strengthens the structure. Each discovery confirms that evolution's architecture is sound. The cathedral is built from finch beaks. From the Galapagos finches showing how isolation and adaptation produce diversity. From pigeons showing how selection produces change. From careful observations of variation within species. From breeding experiments demonstrating heritability. From every measurement of beak size or wing length or any trait showing that populations vary, that variation is inherited, that selection can act upon it. The small observations matter. The detailed measurements matter. The patient documentation of variation matters, because evolution works through accumulation of small changes. Because understanding large-scale transformation requires understanding small-scale variation. The finches teach mechanism, the beaks show process. The variation demonstrates raw material upon which selection acts. The cathedral is built from embryos, from observation that embryos of different species resemble each other more than adults do, from recognition that developmental similarities testify to common ancestry. From understanding that evolution modifies development, that changes in how organisms develop produce changes in adult form, that embryology preserves traces of evolutionary history. The embryos reveal relationships, show connections between organisms that look very different as adults, demonstrate that humans and fish and birds share developmental program inherited from common ancestor. The embryological evidence is particularly powerful because it cannot be explained by separate creation, cannot be attributed to similar environmental needs, makes sense only if species share ancestry, only if development was inherited from common ancestor and then modified in different lineages. The cathedral grows with every discovery. Every new finding in genetics confirms evolutionary prediction. DNA reveals molecular evidence of common ancestry. All life uses same genetic code, same basic biochemistry, testifying to single origin. Comparing genetic sequences shows relationships matching those predicted from anatomy and fossils. Shows humans share 98% of DNA with chimpanzees, confirms that we are closely related. Shows that similarities decrease with evolutionary distance. Humans share less DNA with mice than with chimps, share less with fish than with mice, pattern exactly matching evolutionary tree constructed from anatomical evidence. The genetic evidence was unavailable to Darwin, is 20th and 21st century confirmation of 19th century theory, is new pillar supporting same cathedral. The cathedral stands in every biology department and natural history museum. Stands in every textbook and research paper, stands as organizing framework for all biological knowledge. Evolution is not one theory among many in biology, is foundational principle, is framework through which every biological observation is understood. Medical researchers study evolution of antibiotic resistance. Agricultural scientists apply evolutionary principles to breeding crops. Conservation biologists use evolutionary theory to protect endangered species. Every practical application of biology draws on evolutionary framework. The cathedral is not merely abstract structure, is practical edifice housing useful knowledge, is architecture that enables understanding and prediction and application. But the cathedral is never complete, is always under construction. Every new discovery adds detail, every new finding refines understanding. The basic architecture stands solid: common ancestry, descent with modification, natural selection. But details continue being elaborated. Modern evolutionary theory incorporates genetics that Darwin knew nothing about, understands mechanisms of inheritance through DNA, recognizes neutral evolution where changes occur through drift rather than selection, distinguishes types of selection: directional, stabilizing, disruptive. Identifies processes Darwin did not know: gene flow, genetic drift, horizontal gene transfer. The elaborations strengthen rather than weaken the structure. Show that evolutionary framework can accommodate new knowledge, can incorporate discoveries that extend and refine without requiring fundamental revision. The cathedral Darwin built from coral and bones and finches and embryos and patient observation stands firmer now than in 1859. Stands confirmed by century and a half of evidence, stands as biology's central organizing principle, stands as monument not in stone but in understanding. Darwin gave biology its architecture, gave the discipline coherence, gave scattered observations unified meaning. The cathedral, the structure built from evidence, the framework organizing knowledge, forever standing, forever growing, forever Darwin's gift, forever the transformation from collection to science. The cathedral, built from coral and bones, built from finches and embryos, built from careful observation and brilliant insight, forever biology's foundation. Forever the architecture of understanding, forever the cathedral where life's diversity finds explanation, forever. The origin provokes crisis, not merely intellectual disagreement but deep spiritual disturbance. Victorian Christianity rests on Genesis, on creation story that gives humans meaning, that places humanity at center of divine plan, that makes earth and life deliberate products of God's will. Evolution threatens everything. If species arose through natural processes rather than divine creation, what becomes of Genesis? If humans descended from apes rather than being made in God's image, what becomes of human dignity? If natural selection rather than providence shapes life, what becomes of faith in loving Creator who cares for creation? The questions are not abstract, are personal, are threatening to believers whose worldview rests on biblical authority. The storm breaks as soon as origin is published. Is inevitable collision between science and faith, between evidence and scripture, between new understanding and traditional belief. The religious response is varied. Some reject evolution entirely, insist on literal reading of Genesis, declare that Earth is young 6,000 years old, that species were separately created in 6 days, that fossils are either remnants of Noah's flood or are tests of faith planted by God. The rejection is absolute, is refusal to compromise. Is determination to defend Scripture against scientific challenge. Bishops denounce Darwin from pulpits. Clergy publish pamphlets refuting evolution. Religious journals condemn origin as atheistic attack on Christianity. The opposition is fierce, is sometimes vicious. Darwin is mocked, is caricatured as ape, is accused of destroying morality by denying divine origin of conscience. The attacks are personal. Are assaults not just on theory but on Darwin himself, on his character, on his motivations. The religious opposition will continue for decades, will persist into present day, where some Christians still reject evolution, still insist on young Earth, still view evolutionary biology as incompatible with faith. But other religious responses are more nuanced. Some clergy seek accommodation, argue that evolution is God's method of creation, that Genesis is theological rather than scientific text, that understanding how God created does not diminish divine role, that natural processes are instruments of divine will rather than alternatives to it. Charles Kingsley, Anglican priest and Darwin's correspondent, writes that God creating through evolution is more magnificent than God creating separately. That it is nobler conception of deity to imagine God establishing laws that generate diversity than to imagine God separately crafting each species. The accommodation preserves faith while accepting scientific evidence, allows Christians to remain Christian while acknowledging evolutionary truth. The approach will become dominant in mainstream Christianity, will lead to interpretations of Genesis as allegory or poetry rather than literal history. Will create space for believers who accept science while maintaining faith. The theological challenge is profound. If evolution is true, several traditional Christian doctrines become problematic. The fall: if humans evolved gradually from earlier primates, when did fall occur? When did sin enter the world? Was there Edenic state before fall, or is suffering and death inherent in evolutionary process? Original sin: if humans are products of evolution rather than degraded from perfect creation, what becomes of doctrine that humans are fallen and require salvation? The soul: if humans evolved from animals, when did soul arise? Do animals have souls? Is soul product of brain evolution? Divine providence: if natural selection drives adaptation, what role for God's ongoing care for creation? The questions multiply. Each doctrine requires reinterpretation. Each belief requires theological adjustment to accommodate evolutionary framework. The Oxford debate in 1860 becomes legendary. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, eloquent speaker and evolution opponent, debates Thomas Henry Huxley, biologist and Darwin's most aggressive defender. The debate is public spectacle, draws large crowd, represents broader conflict between science and religion. Wilberforce speaks first, ridicules evolution, mocks the theory, then turns to Huxley and asks mockingly whether Huxley claims descent from apes on his grandmother's side or his grandfather's side. The question is meant to humiliate. is implying that accepting evolution means accepting disgraceful ancestry. Huxley responds famously that he would rather have ape for grandfather than man who uses eloquence and authority to obscure truth with ridicule. The response is devastating, is turning Wilberforce's mockery back on him, is asserting that intellectual dishonesty is more shameful than animal ancestry. The exchange captures the conflict: faith's certainty confronting science's evidence, religious authority confronting scientific method, traditional belief confronting new understanding. But the conflict is not simple opposition of religion versus science. Many religious scientists accept evolution. Asa Gray, Harvard botanist and devout Christian, becomes Darwin's leading American supporter. Defends evolution publicly while maintaining personal faith. Argues that natural selection is compatible with divine design, that God could have used natural selection as means of implementing divine plan. Gray's position allows him to accept Darwin's science while preserving his Christian commitments. Other religious scientists follow similar path, accept evidence while finding ways to reconcile it with faith. The reconciliation requires flexibility, requires willingness to reinterpret Scripture, requires distinguishing between Bible's theological truth and its scientific accuracy. But reconciliation is possible, is achieved by many scientists who remain both Christians and evolutionists. Darwin himself loses faith, but not because of evolution. His loss of faith is gradual process through 1850s and 1860s. Is driven partly by difficulty reconciling benevolent creator with nature's cruelty, the wasp that paralyzes caterpillar and lays eggs in its body so larvae can eat it alive seems incompatible with loving God. Is driven partly by suffering he witnesses, particularly death of his daughter Annie in 1851, loss that devastates him and makes him question providence. Is driven partly by intellectual honesty as he becomes convinced that natural processes explain life, supernatural explanations seem unnecessary. By time Origin is published, Darwin considers himself agnostic, does not declare himself atheist, that term is too definitive, but has lost belief in personal God, in providence, in Christian salvation, remains respectful of religion, understands its value to believers like Emma, but cannot maintain faith that his own scientific work has undermined. Emma's faith remains strong. The divergence creates tension in the marriage. Emma worries about Darwin's soul, worries that his loss of faith means they will be separated in eternity, writes him letters pleading that he not reject God completely. Darwin is tender with her concerns, does not mock her faith, does not try to undermine her beliefs, keeps his loss of faith private, allows Emma her consolations. The religious difference is painful for both, is source of quiet grief, but does not destroy their love. They remain devoted to each other despite theological disagreement. The personal dimension of the conflict between faith and science plays out in their marriage, two people who love each other navigating fundamental disagreement about ultimate questions. Over time, the religious storm subsides. Evolution becomes accepted even in many religious circles. Genesis is reinterpreted. Theology adjusts. Faith finds ways to accommodate scientific truth. The accommodation is not universal. Fundamentalist Christianity continues rejecting evolution, but mainstream Christianity gradually accepts that evolution is fact, that Genesis is not scientific textbook, that faith and science can coexist if religion does not make empirical claims that science can test. The adjustment takes generations, takes reinterpretation of Scripture, takes willingness to distinguish between faith's core claims and peripheral beliefs inherited from pre-scientific worldview. But the adjustment happens. The cathedral of science stands alongside cathedral of faith. Both claim truth but in different domains. The religious storm, when faith met science, when Genesis encountered evolution, when belief confronted evidence. Forever marking moment when religion had to choose reject science or reinterpret Scripture. Most chose reinterpretation. Most found ways to remain faithful while accepting evolution. The storm, the conflict, the eventual accommodation, forever testimony to tension between traditional belief and new knowledge, forever Darwin's inadvertent challenge to faith, forever the transformation of theology forced by biology, the storm, subsiding but never completely settled, forever the uneasy relationship between what faith teaches and what science reveals, forever. Darwin's theory makes predictions, claims that if evolution is true, certain things should be found, fossils showing transitions between major groups should exist, geographic distribution should match evolutionary history, species should share genetic material, embryonic development should reveal common ancestry. Every prediction creates opportunity for theory to be proven wrong. If transitional fossils are never found, if biogeography contradicts evolutionary expectations, if genetics reveals fundamental discontinuity between species, then evolution fails. The theory is testable, is vulnerable to disproof. This vulnerability is strength rather than weakness, is what makes evolution science rather than dogma. Karl Popper's criterion good scientific theory is one that can be proven wrong. Evolution meets criterion, makes predictions that could be falsified. And every prediction that proves true, every discovery that confirms rather than contradicts, strengthens the theory. The evidence accumulates across 160 years since Origin was published, accumulates until evolution is among most strongly supported theories in all of science. The fossil evidence expands dramatically after Darwin. Archaeopteryx is discovered in Germany in 1861, just 2 years after Origin. Shows clear mixture of reptile and bird features, teeth and tail like reptile, feathers and wings like bird. Is transitional form that Darwin predicted but could not demonstrate with fossils available to him. The discovery is triumph, is confirmation that transitional forms exist, that they can be found, that evolution's predictions about fossil record are accurate. More transitional fossils follow. Tiktaalik discovered in 2004 in Canadian Arctic. Shows fish evolving features needed for terrestrial life, limb-like fins, neck, lungs, flat head. Is transition between fish and tetrapods. Is fishapod preserving moment when vertebrates colonized land. Countless other transitional fossils document major transitions, reptile to mammal, land mammal to whale, dinosaur to bird. Each discovery confirms evolutionary prediction. Each fossil fills gap that creationists claimed could never be filled. The whale evolution story is particularly dramatic. Whales are mammals that return to sea. Their front limbs evolved into flippers, their hind limbs disappeared. Their ancestors were land animals. Darwin knew this from whale anatomy. Whales have hip bones that serve no function, are vestiges of hind limbs their ancestors possessed. But in Darwin's time, no transitional fossils connected land mammals to whales. The gap seemed unbridgeable. How could evolution transform land animal into fully aquatic whale? The fossils have been found. Pakistis from Pakistan shows early whale ancestor that was still primarily terrestrial. Ambulocetus shows more aquatic adaptation while retaining functional legs. Dorudin shows nearly modern whale body plan but still with small hind limbs. The sequence documents transformation over 25 million years. Documents gradual return to sea. Confirms Darwin's prediction that intermediate forms would be discovered. Genetics provides evidence Darwin could not imagine. DNA was unknown in Darwin's time. Mechanism of inheritance was mystery. Darwin proposed gemmules as units of heredity but was completely wrong about molecular basis. The discovery of DNA in 20th century could have contradicted evolution, could have shown that inheritance works differently than evolution requires. Instead, genetics confirms evolution perfectly, confirms that all life uses same genetic code, same DNA, same RNA, same amino acids, confirms common ancestry at molecular level, allows comparison of genetic sequences showing relationships matching those predicted from anatomy. Human and chimp genomes are 98% identical. Human and mouse genomes are 85% identical. Human and fruit fly genomes share many genes. The pattern is exact match for evolutionary tree constructed from fossils and anatomy. Genetics didn't just confirm evolution, provided mechanism Darwin lacked, showed that genes mutate, that mutations create variation, that natural selection acts on genetic variation, completed the theory. molecular clocks extend prediction. If DNA accumulates mutations at roughly constant rate, then comparing genetic sequences allows estimating when lineages diverged. The technique predicts divergence times that can be tested against fossil record. Predictions mostly match fossils. When discrepancies occur, often turn out to reveal problems with fossil dates rather than with molecular estimates. The molecular evidence becomes independent line of evidence supporting same evolutionary history revealed by fossils and anatomy. Three different types of evidence: morphological, paleontological, molecular, all pointing to same evolutionary relationships. The convergence is powerful confirmation, is virtually impossible to explain except through common ancestry. Biogeography continues confirming evolutionary predictions. Island species resemble nearest mainland species because islands were colonized from mainland and then populations diverged through isolation. Oceanic islands lack native land mammals except bats because mammals cannot fly across ocean to colonize islands. Marsupials dominate Australia because Australia separated from other continents before placental mammals evolved, allowing marsupials to radiate into niches occupied by placental mammals elsewhere. Every geographic pattern makes evolutionary sense. Every distribution can be explained through history of migration and isolation. No pattern contradicts evolution. No distribution requires invoking separate creation. Embryology reveals common ancestry. All vertebrate embryos pass through stage with gill-like structures and tail. Makes no sense if fish and mammals were separately created. Makes perfect sense if all vertebrates descended from aquatic ancestor with gills. Human embryos showing gill-like structures testify to our fish ancestry. All mammal embryos pass through stage where they look remarkably similar. Makes sense only if mammals share recent common ancestor. The developmental similarities cannot be explained by similar adult needs. Human embryo and fish embryo have very different adult forms but similar embryonic stages. Similarity can only be explained by inheritance of developmental program from common ancestor. Observed evolution confirms that process continues. Peppered moths in England evolved darker coloration during Industrial Revolution when pollution darkened tree bark, making dark moths better camouflaged. Return to lighter coloration after pollution controls cleaned environment. Change happened across just decades. Was natural selection observed in real time? Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is evolution happening now. Bacteria evolve resistance to drugs through mutations that are selected when antibiotics kill susceptible bacteria but spare resistant ones. Same process that produces new species over millions of years produces resistant bacteria over years. HIV evolves within individual patients, becoming resistant to antiviral drugs. Influenza evolves new strains requiring yearly vaccine updates. Evolution is not just historical theory, is ongoing process observable in present. Experiments demonstrate evolution in laboratory. Bacteria are grown through thousands of generations. Mutations occur. Selection acts. Populations adapt to new environments. Sometimes new capabilities evolve. Bacteria that could not digest certain sugar evolve ability to do so. Sometimes populations diverge into incipient species populations that no longer interbreed efficiently when brought together after evolving separately. The experiments show that evolution happens, that natural selection produces adaptation, that speciation can occur. Richard Lenski's E. coli experiment has run for over 70,000 bacterial generations since 1988. Has documented countless evolutionary changes. Has preserved frozen samples allowing researchers to rewind evolution and study how changes occurred. The experimental evidence confirms that Darwin's mechanism works. Every new discovery could contradict evolution. Every fossil could be out of sequence. Every genetic comparison could show relationships contradicting anatomy. Every biogeographic pattern could require separate creation, but it never happens. Every discovery fits evolutionary framework. Every finding confirms predictions. the evidence accumulates until evolution is as well established as gravity or atomic theory. Accumulates until denying evolution requires ignoring overwhelming evidence from multiple independent disciplines. The cathedral stands on foundation that grows stronger with every stone added, the evidence that accumulates with every discovery, the confirmation that continues. The predictions that prove true, the theory that survives every test, forever validated, forever strengthened, forever standing as one of science's most robust theories. Forever Darwin's insight confirmed by century and a half of research, the evidence, the accumulation, the confirmation, forever. The year is 2025, over 165 years since Origin was published. Over a century and a half since Darwin revealed evolution through natural selection. One might expect universal acceptance by now, might expect that overwhelming evidence would have convinced everyone, that evolution would be uncontroversial established fact like heliocentrism or atomic theory, but resistance persists. In the United States, significant percentage of population rejects evolution, believes Earth is young, believes species were separately created, believes Genesis is literal history. In some communities, teaching evolution in schools is controversial. Some states have attempted to mandate teaching alternatives, intelligent design, creationism alongside evolution. Some textbooks minimize or avoid evolutionary content to avoid controversy. The resistance is cultural rather than scientific. Is religious rather than evidence-based, but is real and shapes how evolution is taught and accepted. Among scientists, evolution is not controversial, is accepted fact in biology comparable to gravity's acceptance in physics. No credible biologist disputes common ancestry or natural selection's importance. Debates exist about mechanisms, about relative importance of selection versus drift, about pace of evolutionary change, about specific evolutionary pathways. But the debates are about details, about refining understanding, not about whether evolution occurred. Every major scientific organization endorses evolution. National Academy of Sciences, American Association for Advancement of Science, every professional society in biology. The scientific consensus is overwhelming. Evolution is biology's foundational principle, is framework through which every biological observation is understood. Rejecting evolution while claiming to do biology is like rejecting atoms while claiming to do chemistry, is incoherent, but public understanding lags scientific consensus. Polls in the United States consistently show that 40% or more of adults reject evolution, believe God created humans in present form within last 10,000 years. The rejection correlates with religious fundamentalism. Evangelical Christians are most likely to reject evolution. Mainline Christians more likely to accept it. Non-religious individuals almost universally accept it. The pattern suggests resistance is theological rather than scientific, is based on commitment to biblical literalism, is reaction against perceived threat to religious worldview. Evolution challenges Genesis, challenges human exceptionalism, challenges belief in divine creation and providential plan. For believers deeply committed to literal biblical interpretation, accepting evolution seems like accepting atheism, seems like betraying faith. The resistance persists because for many people, evolution is not merely scientific theory but is religious challenge. The cultural conflict plays out in education. Some school boards attempt to exclude evolution from science curriculum or to mandate teaching creationism alongside evolution. The attempts mostly fail when challenged in court. U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that teaching creationism in public schools violates separation of church and state. But controversy affects how evolution is taught even where it is taught. Teachers sometimes minimize evolutionary content to avoid conflict with religious parents. Textbooks sometimes present evolution tentatively, as just a theory rather than as established fact. Students from religious families sometimes reject evolution even when taught it. The cultural resistance creates educational problem, creates situation where significant portion of American students graduate without understanding biology's central organizing principle. International resistance varies. In some Muslim-majority countries, evolution is rejected or minimized due to conflict with Quranic creation accounts. In Turkey, evolution is taught only in higher education, not in primary schools. In some European countries, resistance is negligible. Evolution is taught as established fact without controversy. The variation shows that resistance to evolution is cultural phenomenon rather than inherent feature of the science. Shows that acceptance depends on cultural and religious context more than on evidence. In societies where religious literalism is less prevalent, evolution is accepted. In societies where religious authority is strong and literal interpretation of scripture is valued, evolution faces resistance. The pattern confirms that controversy is about religion, not about science, but resistance reveals something important about Darwin's insight, reveals how revolutionary it was, how deeply it disturbs human self-conception. Evolution is not merely technical adjustment to scientific understanding, is fundamental transformation of how humans see themselves. For thousands of years, humans believed we were separate from nature, created specially, made in God's image, possessing immortal souls, holding dominion over animals. Evolution says no, says we are animals, says we evolved from earlier primates, says our minds and morals are products of natural processes, says there is no essential difference between humans and other life. The claim is disturbing, is challenging core belief about human uniqueness, is forcing recognition that we are part of nature rather than separate from it. The resistance testifies to how difficult this recognition is, how threatening to traditional understanding, how much evolution demands we rethink everything. Darwin anticipated the resistance, knew his theory would disturb, delayed publication partly from fear of reaction, was correct that reaction would be fierce, was correct that many would never accept evolution, but truth endures regardless of acceptance. Evolution is true whether believed or not. Evidence supports it whether acknowledged or not. Natural selection shapes living things whether humans recognize it or not. The resistance does not weaken the theory, cannot change the facts, can only delay understanding, can only create gap between what is true and what is believed. The gap is costly, is scientific illiteracy, is denial of established knowledge, is choosing comfortable falsehood over uncomfortable truth. But the gap does not make evolution less true, makes believers less informed. The practical consequences of evolution acceptance are significant. Medicine depends on evolutionary understanding. Antibiotic resistance evolves. Understanding evolution is essential for developing treatment strategies. Vaccines must be updated. As viruses evolve, flu vaccine is reformulated yearly because influenza evolves. Cancer evolves within individual patients. Understanding evolutionary dynamics of tumor cells informs treatment. Rejecting evolution while accepting modern medicine is incoherent, is using fruits of evolutionary science while denying theory that makes the science possible. Agriculture depends on evolutionary principles. Crop breeding is applied evolution, is artificial selection producing varieties with desired traits. Understanding evolution improves breeding efficiency. Conservation biology depends on evolutionary framework. Protecting endangered species requires understanding population genetics, understanding how small populations lose diversity, understanding how species adapt to changing environments. Rejecting evolution undermines practical applications that depend on evolutionary theory. The resistance that lingers is ultimately resistance to truth, is preferring traditional belief to scientific evidence, is valuing religious authority over empirical observation, is defending doctrine against data. The resistance is understandable, is human tendency to protect cherished beliefs, is difficulty of changing worldview, is fear that accepting evolution means losing meaning, losing purpose, losing connection to God. But resistance does not change truth, does not make evolution less factual, does not make creationism more plausible. The truth endures, endures despite rejection, endures despite controversy, endures because evidence is overwhelming, endures because evolution is real. Darwin's theory survives because it is true, survives 165 years of testing, survives every attempt to disprove it, Survives discovery of genetics that could have contradicted it but confirmed it instead. Survives molecular biology revealing common ancestry at chemical level. Survives experimental tests and observational studies and fossil discoveries. Survives because every new finding in biology confirms evolutionary prediction rather than contradicting it. The theory that faces such persistent resistance yet continues standing must be more than speculation, must be solid understanding of reality, must be truth too well supported to be overturned by disbelief. The resistance that lingers and the truth that endures. Forever the tension between what is comfortable and what is real. Forever the gap between belief and evidence. Forever Darwin's legacy challenging humanity to accept what is true rather than what is wished. The resistance, the truth, forever both present. Forever evolution standing despite resistance. Forever Darwin vindicated by evidence even when rejected by belief. Forever. Near the end of Origin, Darwin pauses, steps back from detailed arguments about finch beaks and pigeon breeding and vestigial organs, offers instead a vision, a way of seeing life that synthesizes everything the book has argued. He writes, there is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. The sentence is unusual for Origin, is poetic where rest of book is methodical, is sweeping where rest is careful. Is expressing wonder where rest is presenting evidence, but the poetry is earned, is Darwin's authentic response to the understanding he has uncovered, is recognition that evolution is not merely mechanism but is revelation, is process producing not just diversity but beauty, not just adaptation but wonder. The grandeur is in the unity. All life descends from common origin. The bacteria in soil, the trees in forest, the insects in air, the fish in oceans, the birds overhead, the mammals on land, all cousins, all sharing ancestry, all branches on single immense tree extending across billions of years. The unity is humbling, makes human existence not exceptional but continuous with all living things, makes us part of life's family rather than separate from it. But the unity is also elevating, connects us to everything. Makes us relatives of every organism that has ever lived, makes evolutionary history our history. The journey from first cells to humans is our journey. The innovations that allowed life to colonize land, to take flight, to develop complex nervous systems, all our inheritance. We carry in our bodies the accumulated achievements of 3 billion years of evolution. Carry genes inherited from earliest life forms. Carry structures refined across countless generations. Carry the history of life written in our DNA. The grandeur is in the process. Evolution is creative in ways that exceed human imagination. Has produced eyes in dozens of different forms, compound eyes of insects, camera eyes of vertebrates, pinhole eyes of nautilus, multiple lenses of jumping spiders. Has produced flight independently in insects, pterosaurs, birds, bats. Has produced venoms thousands of times in different lineages, each evolving toxic proteins through modification of existing genes. Has produced bioluminescence, electroreception, echolocation, magnetoreception, sensory capacities humans do not possess and can barely comprehend. The creativity is not conscious design, is not intentional, is emergent property of variation and selection acting over vast time, but the results rival or exceed anything conscious designer has produced. The elephant's trunk, the orchid's flower, the peacock's tail, the dolphin's sonar, each product of evolution's patient experimentation. The grandeur is in the adaptation. Every organism is exquisitely fitted to its environment. The Arctic fox's white coat camouflaging it against snow. The desert cactus's water storage and protective spines. The deep-sea fish's bioluminescence attracting prey in permanent darkness. The monarch butterfly's toxic compounds protecting it from predators. Each adaptation arose through natural selection, through countless generations where individuals slightly better adapted survived and reproduced more successfully, through accumulated small changes producing perfect fit between organism and environment. The adaptations testify not to conscious design but to power of selection, to nature's ability to shape living things through simple process of survival and reproduction. The perfection is not planned, is discovered, is found through blind exploration of possible forms with only successful forms surviving. But the result is beauty, is wonder, is endless forms suited to endless niches. The poetry is in the continuity. Humans are not exempt from evolution, are not separate from nature's processes, are products of same mechanisms that shaped every other living thing. The recognition is simultaneously humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it denies human exceptionalism, because it places us among animals rather than above them, because it makes our existence accident of evolutionary history rather than purpose of creation. But inspiring because it reveals how remarkable evolution is, that it produced us, that it produced consciousness, language, art, science, morality, that through natural selection and variation in time, matter organized itself into forms capable of understanding their own origins. That we are universe becoming aware of itself. The recognition that humans are nature's products rather than separate creations does not diminish humanity, elevates evolution, shows that natural processes are capable of producing everything we value about being human. The poetry is in the ongoing process. Evolution has not stopped, is continuing now. Species are still adapting, still changing, still responding to selection pressures. New species are forming as populations diverge. Existing species are going extinct as environments change faster than adaptation can follow. The tree of life is still branching, still growing, still exploring new forms. What will life become given another billion years? What forms will evolve that we cannot imagine? What capacities will develop that current life does not possess? Evolution's creativity is inexhaustible, is limited only by physical laws and by time available. The future is open, is undefined, is waiting to be discovered through evolutionary process that never ceases. We live on a planet where life has been evolving for over 3 billion years and will continue evolving for billions more. Are witnesses to process that was ancient before humans existed and will continue long after humans are gone. The poetry is in the transformation of understanding. Before Darwin, life's diversity seemed chaotic, seemed arbitrary collection of forms created for reasons unknowable. Darwin revealed order, revealed that diversity arises from unity through branching descent, revealed that adaptation arises through selection, revealed that seemingly separate species are connected through ancestry. The understanding transforms how we see living things, transforms taxonomy from arbitrary classification into genealogy, transforms anatomy from mere description into study of evolutionary history, transforms ecology from observation of how organisms live into understanding of how they came to live that way. Evolution is lens through which all biology becomes comprehensible, is principle that makes sense of everything. Theodosius Dobzhansky famously wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The statement is accurate. Evolution illuminates, makes visible what was hidden, makes comprehensible what was mysterious. Darwin gave humanity dual gift. Gift of understanding and gift of perspective. The understanding is evolution through natural selection mechanism explaining life's diversity. The perspective is seeing ourselves as part of nature, as products of evolutionary processes, as relatives of all living things, as temporary forms in ongoing process that began before us and will continue after us. The perspective is antidote to human arrogance, is recognition that we are not masters of nature but are products of nature, are not separate from life but are embedded in it, are not immune to evolutionary forces but are subject to them. The perspective should inspire humility, should inspire connection to other living things, should inspire responsibility for preserving diversity that evolution has produced, the endless forms most beautiful, evolution's poetry, the grandeur in this view of life. Darwin's vision remains as powerful now as in 1859, remains invitation to see living world anew. To recognize unity underlying diversity, to appreciate creativity of natural processes, to understand our place in nature, to wonder at the fact that from simple beginning, from first replicating molecules from single origin 3 billion years ago, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. The poetry, the grandeur, the vision, forever Darwin's gift, forever evolution's revelation. Forever the beauty in understanding how life's diversity arose through natural processes. Forever the endless forms, forever beautiful, forever wonderful, forever evolving, forever. Conclusion. The evening deepens. The story of Charles Darwin draws to close. We have journeyed from the Beagle's deck to Down House's study, from the Galapagos Islands to Victorian London, from secret notebooks to published origin, from private heresy to public revolution. We have witnessed the transformation of biology from collection to science, have seen how one man's patient observation and careful thinking revealed life's history, have understood how evolution through natural selection became biology's central organizing principle. The journey has been long, has covered decades of Darwin's life, has explored complexity of revolutionary discovery, has recognized both achievement and cost of revealing truth that disturbed Victorian certainty. Darwin died in 1882 at age 73, was buried in Westminster Abbey despite his agnosticism, recognition that his scientific contributions transcended religious controversy. The funeral was attended by leaders of British science and society. The burial placed him among Britain's most honored dead. The recognition came during his lifetime, came as evolution became accepted despite resistance, came as Darwin's contributions were acknowledged even by those who opposed his conclusions. The man who had feared controversy, who had delayed publication, who had suffered illness and isolation, received in his final years the recognition he deserved, received acknowledgement that he had transformed biology, that he had revealed fundamental truth about living world, that he had given humanity new understanding of itself. But Darwin's legacy is not merely historical, is not merely contribution to 19th century science. Evolution continues shaping biology today. Is foundation for genetics, molecular biology, medicine, agriculture, conservation, is framework through which every biological observation is understood. Modern evolutionary theory incorporates knowledge Darwin lacked: genetics, molecular biology, population dynamics, but core insight remains Darwin's, remains recognition that species evolve through natural selection acting on variation, remains understanding that all life shares common ancestry, remains vision of life as branching tree rather than ladder. The insight that transformed biology in 1859 continues organizing biological knowledge in 2025, continues being tested and confirmed, continues standing as one of science's most robust theories. The cultural impact extends beyond biology. Evolution influenced philosophy, ethics, social theory, literature, art, influenced how humans understand themselves. Forced recognition that we are animals, that our existence is not planned, that our place in nature is continuous rather than exceptional. The recognition was disturbing, challenged human dignity, threatened religious faith, created crises for individuals and institutions built on assumption of human exceptionalism. But the recognition was also liberating, freed humans from need for external validation, made our existence meaningful because we create meaning rather than receiving it from Creator, made morality our responsibility rather than divine command, made understanding our origins possible through scientific investigation rather than requiring revealed truth. The resistance Darwin anticipated continues. Religious fundamentalism still rejects evolution. Young Earth creationism still insists on literal genesis. Intelligent design movement still attempts to find divine intervention in biological complexity. The resistance testifies to evolution's continuing challenge to traditional worldviews, testifies to difficulty of accepting that humans are products of natural processes. But resistance also testifies to evolution's truth. Ideas that face such sustained opposition yet continue standing are not easily dismissed falsehoods, are challenging truths that force uncomfortable recognitions. Evolution stands despite resistance because evidence is overwhelming. because predictions prove true, because every new discovery confirms rather than contradicts. The truth Darwin revealed endures whether accepted or not. Tonight we have explored revolutionary idea through life of man who discovered it. Have understood Darwin not as abstract scientist, but as human being, as young naturalist on voyage of discovery, as ill gentleman working privately on dangerous theory, as husband protecting wife from distress his work would cause, as careful methodical thinker building case that would transform biology. Have recognized that scientific revolutions are human accomplishments, are products of individual minds grappling with observations, wrestling with implications, gathering courage to publish conclusions that will disturb established understanding. Darwin's achievement was not merely intellectual, was moral, was willingness to follow evidence even when evidence contradicted belief, was commitment to truth even when truth was uncomfortable. The story we have explored is both complete and incomplete. Is complete because Darwin's life ended in 1882. Because Origin was published in 1859, because the theory was formed and defended and eventually accepted. But is incomplete because evolution continues, because the process Darwin revealed is ongoing, because life continues branching into forms we cannot predict, because evolutionary science continues developing, continues refining understanding, continues confirming Darwin's fundamental insight while elaborating details he could not know. The story of evolution is still being written. Is written in every new fossil discovered, in every genome sequenced, in every population adapting to changing environment, in every experiment testing evolutionary predictions. The story Darwin began continues without him. As the night deepens further, as we prepare for sleep, we carry with us Darwin's vision, the vision of life as unity and diversity, as simple beginning producing endless forms, as ongoing process rather than completed creation. As natural phenomenon comprehensible through observation and reason. The vision is simultaneously humbling and exalting, humbling because it denies human exceptionalism, exalting because it reveals humanity as product of evolution's creativity, as nature becoming aware of itself, as matter organized into consciousness capable of understanding its own origins. We are privileged to live in age when life's history is knowable, when the mechanisms of evolution are understood. When we can trace our ancestry back through primates and mammals and reptiles and fish to first cells, when we can see ourselves as part of nature's great experiment in form and function. Darwin gave us gift of understanding, gave us evolution through natural selection, gave us framework for comprehending life's diversity, gave us recognition of our place in nature. The gift cost him, cost health and comfort, cost peace of mind and freedom from controversy. Cost the easy certainty of faith he had possessed as young man, but the gift was worth the cost. Was revelation too important to withhold? Was truth too fundamental to leave undiscovered? We inherit the gift, inherit the understanding, inherit the responsibility to accept truth even when uncomfortable, to follow evidence even when it contradicts cherished beliefs, to see clearly rather than seeing what we wish to see. The voyage is complete, the notebooks are filled, the origin is published. The evidence accumulates, the theory endures, and Charles Darwin rests in Westminster Abbey having transformed how humanity understands itself in the living world. The evening fades to night, the story ends, but evolution continues, forever branching, forever adapting, forever producing endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful, forever testifying to the grandeur in this view of life, forever Darwin's legacy to humanity, forever the truth that changed everything. Sleep now. And in sleeping, know that you are product of 3 billion years of evolution, are cousin to every living thing, are participant in process that continues around you even as you rest, are evidence of evolution's creativity, are yourself one of the endless forms, beautiful, wonderful, evolved forever.